So now that we've talked about pacing and pausing, I want to end this unit by talking about gestures and movement. Once again, to think back to that grading rubric that we talked about at the beginning of the assignment, you'll notice we've talked about each one of those elements, and the last element on there is the speaker used gestures and movement effectively and appropriately. So I want to end by talking about these issues. When we think about gestures and movement, ultimately it comes down to we want the gestures and movement to augment clarity for the speeches that we're working on and to look purposeful, to look intentional. Okay? So if you'll remember back to that speech apprehension video where the guy was at the city council meeting, right, and he took off his glasses and they were doing this and all that, that clearly was unintentional movement. He had no idea what was going on. His arm was off doing its own thing while he was speaking. He was so nervous. Okay, so we want to make sure that our movement and gestures look purposeful and add to clarity. So let's talk about gestures first. So gestures should clearly relate to your content. Okay. If you remember back to when we talked about literacy and orality, we don't have bold or italics when we stand up to speak, but gestures can perform some of that role, right? They highlight certain ideas. They underscore certain words, okay? But gestures don't illustrate. You should be thinking about it that way. We're not doing public speaking through sign, although I think that raises a whole host of really fascinating challenges, how signing for a speech is different from signing conversationally. But we're not doing that in this class. And so in that sense, our gestures don't need to illustrate. So you don't say, the other day I got out on the boat and the seas were rocky, but the sun was shining, okay? You're not doing that. But they do need to work in tandem with what you're saying, okay? So in this sense, if you want to gesture, make sure you're gesturing, okay? We sort of often do this. It's part of how we communicate. Now, if you do gesture, make sure the gestures are coming up and out. They're here. They're part of the performance. We would talk about this as your gesture box. Here's my gesture box. It's right here in front of me. My gestures come up and out into the gesture box. Most of them are going to be here. Maybe occasionally I want to do a point up here, but only very rarely, right? I don't say, I'm not doing my impromptu speech. I strongly believe in lighting. Lighting is wonderful for two main reasons, first and second. So first, right? We're not doing that, okay? Your gestures are coming out and into the gesture box. Now, why we want to do that is this is where we want our attention to be. Sometimes when people are nervous and they don't know what to do with their hands, they'll lock them in at their sides. Problem is, they've still got all the energy that they want to express when they're getting up and standing and delivering that speech. So they end up talking with their hands anyway. So what happens is they end up doing this. We talk about this being a flipper baby. Don't be a flipper baby. Plus, if you're doing this, where's that drawing the attention? Unless you're doing an informative speech about your pelvis, they don't belong there. Okay, bring them up and out. Okay, this is where you want our attention. So those gestures are coming up into this gesture box, right? And you're using them to illustrate, to underscore your key ideas, okay? But they should look purposeful and they should augment clarity, okay? So if you want to gesture on your preview, I often do that. There are three things I want to talk about: first, second, and third, okay? If it looks natural, great. If not, don't do it. Just like we did on the transitions when we were talking about transitioning, it shouldn't look forced. So too there are three things I want to talk about: first, second, and third. Okay, we don't do that. They should help augment clarity, but they should look natural. Okay, and above all, they should be intentional. You should look like you know what you're doing, or at least you're aware of it. And this holds true when we talk about movement. So in movement, we talked about you can maybe move on a transition. This is a way of being comfortable, being able to use your physical space as a way of illustrating how comfortable you are in the space, but also highlighting the fact that you're no longer in point one, you're over here in point two. Now, you don't have to move, but if you do move, it should look purposeful, it should look clean, it should look intentional. What you don't want, and sometimes you see, right, is a movement where the speaker's standing up there and they're talking to you, but clearly they're not very aware of what they're doing. They just kind of look a little unhinged and ill at ease. Okay, so the movement should look purposeful. But as with gesture, if you want to move, make sure you're doing so. Okay, we have two things that happen in this regard. Sometimes people stand there and then they're just like this the whole time and they're doing their talk. Right? If you have two functioning feet, use them, okay? Stand on 2 feet. The other thing is, if they are standing, they're nervous, they still kind of want to move. They've got all this nervous energy. So they start, putting their weight in their back pocket, and they're doing this. I don't know, you're not dancing for us in the speech. Or the other thing is just slowly kind of going back and forth. If you're reading your notes and you're not looking at the audience, you might find yourself doing this. In this class, as you video your performances, you might go back and take a look at that. If you watch your speech on twice speed and you get a little motion sickness, you're probably seesawing back a little bit too much. Okay? So movement should be purposeful. You might even plan it. I know I'm going to walk on my point one. If you're practicing your speech, practice the speech as much as you can as you will deliver it. Okay? So don't practice your speech sitting at a desk if you're going to be standing up delivering the speech. Okay? Practice the speech as you will deliver it, because then you'll sort of learn what is comfortable, what's uncomfortable. Those movements will become more natural. Okay? One sort of last thing just generally on movement that I want to mention, and again, this doesn't necessarily work as much for this class if you're videoing your speeches, but certainly when you're in front of a live audience, I typically want to be able to throw my arms out in a V and capture most of my audience. So if I'm up here and my audience is all the way to the side, if I've got room, I want to go ahead and move back so I can always capture them. So I'm not blocking out my audience. Hello there. I'm capturing them I'm giving them a big hug. Give your audience a hug. Okay, so I'm capturing most of that audience. But that's a way of sort of using movement, and I can address these different components of the room. So even if you don't walk formally and a long distance on your transition, let's say you don't have a lot of space, but you really want to move, you can do the same thing with just a few shuffle steps. Okay? Boy, this is true for two reasons, first and second. So the first thing is blank, blank, blank. I'm doing my first point. But not only that, this second reason is blank, blank, blank. Okay, so that's movement that's still working to highlight the transition that I'm making, but my footprint's pretty small. Okay, so we've talked about breathing and projection. We've talked about pacing and pausing. We've talked about gestures and movement. We will spend more time talking about delivery when we get to the informative and persuasive sections on delivery. But for now, what I want you to do is, at the end of this video, there's a link to this YouTube playlist that I have on the class YouTube website. And what I want you to do is watch those sample videos. And I've got notes indicating things that I think are interesting in each one of those. Watch those, analyze them. Discuss them in the discussion forum set up for the analysis of these speeches. And as you're doing that, look at that delivery for what's working and what's not working. But also be thinking back to imitation. Okay? Delivery is a really ripe area for studying imitation. Identifying something that someone does physically or through tone or pitch that you really like and you can carry off. So think about how you're going to start incorporating that into your own speech repertoire. So for example, years ago, I had a colleague here in this department, and he was doing a presentation. He was doing it on discourse analytics, and so he kept talking about this one term. And throughout the speech, he had this gesture, and it was, he really got into it. And it was very precise when he was talking about words. And I was watching it, and I'm like, done. That is mine now. I hope there's no plagiarism case on gestures, because I own that. And over the years, I just find myself doing it more and more. It's natural, it's not forced, but I saw something, it seemed to fit within my natural delivery system, so I tried to incorporate it into my own speech repertoire. So as you're watching those videos, analyze them, but also think about good models of delivery imitation.